Hello, welcome back. We're going to get started today with the end of Article 2, the executive branch. I think the video cut off short last time. So we talked about the requirements and terms for the president. They are the same for the vice president. And the wild card clause of the Constitution is kind of like if you ever played Uno or Skip-Bo or anything like that, the wild card that you would get is basically kind of like a freebie. It's going to turn into whatever you want it to be. So the wild card clause of the Constitution goes something like this. The executive power of the United States shall be vested in a president. Well, nowhere does it say what executive power is and what executive power isn't. So that executive power clause has often been referred to as the wild card clause because presidents throughout history have used that specific section of the Constitution to drastically increase their power. Next, we're going to move over to the judicial branch, Article 3 of the Constitution. The judicial branch sets up the federal court system. So whenever we think of the judicial branch, we often think of the Supreme Court, but it also includes other courts as well. You have your district courts, you have your appellate courts, and then, of course, the Supreme Court. And we'll get into all of that when we talk about the judicial branch later on. But according to the Constitution, there are no requirements that Supreme Court or federal court justices must meet in order to serve in that position. So it's kind of strange. The only requirement is that the federal court justices are to be appointed by the president, and their appointment or their nomination is to be approved by the Senate. That's pretty much it. So there's not a natural born citizenship requirement. There's not an education requirement. There's not a background in law requirement, nothing like that. Okay, and the terms, of course, this is super fun. The terms of the federal court justices, basically, they serve until they die or choose to retire. Now, according to our tree of government, if we can think back, we'll get back there for you. The tree of government here, we've got our judicial branch over here, and then we've also got the ability of Congress here to impeach judicial branch members. So it can happen. If the judicial branch is really going wonky, someone in the federal court system could definitely be impeached and removed. So supreme and inferior courts are what's included here in the judicial branch. So if you're jotting this down, which you all should be, the inferior courts would be like the district courts, and then you've got your appellate courts, and then you've got your Supreme Court. And again, we'll talk all about that later on. Jurisdiction. This is a vocabulary term. This term jurisdiction refers to your area of influence or your area of authority, okay? So my classroom is my jurisdiction. That's my area of authority or my area of influence. The jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, basically they can hear whatever cases that they want. But they're definitely going to hear cases if it involves like two different states, if they're having like a boundary dispute or if there's some issue with a specific law. You're obviously going to have the Supreme Court hear that case. Any case that involves a national law and a state law, that's going to be heard by the Supreme Court. It's interesting to note, though, that the Supreme Court receives thousands of requests every year to hear specific cases, and they only take a very, very, very small percentage of them. So just because you petition the Supreme Court to hear your case does not mean they have to. Great, right? All right, moving on then to Article 4. This is the relationship between the States Amendment, or article. Sometimes it's called the Federalism Article. And there are a few main clauses that we want to focus on here. The first clause is the Privileges and Immunities of Citizens Clause. And this clause basically protects every citizen in the United States when they travel across state lines. So if I'm a citizen of Missouri and I go to Illinois, just because I cross state lines does not mean that I'm losing my rights or that I'm losing any protections that I would be afforded by the Constitution. The Full Faith and Credit Clause, again, dealing with relationships between the states. The Full Faith and Credit Clause tells us that each state has to honor the acts, laws, and judicial proceedings of every other state. So if a case is heard in Missouri and people don't like that, they can't go to the state of Massachusetts and say, hey, can you try this case? So every state has to honor the acts and court proceedings and laws of every other state. Next, we have extradition. Extradition is super fun. If you commit a crime in one state and then you flee to another state, that state that you fled to has to send you back to Missouri. So if you commit a crime in Missouri and then you say, ooh, I'm going to run to California and I'm going to be free, not going to happen. Once California and its officials find you, they're going to send you back to Missouri, and where you will be charged and tried for your crime. Now, what happens if you make it to Mexico? The U.S. Constitution doesn't apply in Mexico, so good for you. And the last thing we want to talk about today is admissions of new states and territories. Anytime that we need to add a new state or add a new territory to the United States, Congress has to approve that. Okay? So if you have any questions on this, let me know.